Hello everyone, my name is Neeharika K. I'm doing my BE third year in Chaitanya Bharati Institute of Technology. Today I would be giving a popular science talk on the book Linked by Barabási Albert-László. By the end of this talk, I would like to stress on three major questions, that would be how the rich get richer, the strong get rich, and the winner takes it all. These three questions help us in understanding some phenomena that describe how connections form in real world. First, I would like to start with a story. On February 7th, 2000, it should have been a big day for a big company, Yahoo. Instead, a few million customers that daily flocked to the search engine could not enter the website. That was because correctly at 10:20 Pacific Standard Time, a statement called "Yes, I heard you," "Yes, I heard you" started to cause traffic in their servers. When actual genuine customers who wanted to find out movie links or aeroplane ticket timing and all, they couldn't access the website because Yahoo's server was jammed. This was because a ghost scream called "Yes, I heard you" started to pop up so many times that such a huge traffic was created at its server. It was not possible because the amount of requests it got was not even such number of computers existed there. Similarly, the next day, royal websites like Amazon, eBay, Xtrade, Excite and CNN.com also faced the same problem. Then a high-profile operation by the FBI expected that this would actually be a terrorist attack, but they ended up tracing this back to a pseudonym called Mafia Boy, a 15-year-old successful hacker, successful because of this, caused all this traffic and shutting down of all the servers of such big companies. He just heard the statement "Yes, I heard you" by connecting to the closest systems near his school and library, where he put all these systems on a loop by making these systems again and again access the statement "Yes, I heard you." This was a normal brute force attack. The second story would be about a famous Roman person called Paul. He was against Jesus back then. But initially, after some time, he grew to follow his ideals, and he is a person responsible for the spread of Christianity throughout the world. How he initially started out, the way he connected to the masses, the way he spread the word, he created such a huge foundational network for the religion that right now it is the most followed religion in the world. By these two examples, we understand how Mafia Boy and Paul, even though Mafia Boys was an act of destruction and Paul was a bridge builder between early Christian communities, they both understood the concept of connectedness and they touched everything by merely traveling these already pre-existing connections. The concept of studying science these days is known as riding reductionism. What they initially did, all famous scientists, they took our whole universe, they started to break it down into many different pieces and started to study everything initially. They broke the whole everything they had into such small pieces. Right now they have studied almost all the existing small pieces, but the issue they are facing right now is not being able to connect these small pieces back. The second link. We learn here about the concept of random universe. In this talk, I would be going in the order of how network science is what it is today. How it started to grow, and what and all evolutions have taken place in this subject. First, there was this famous question known as Königsberg Bridge. What actually happened in the city of Königsberg? They laid out a layout in 1875 in an island of Kennesaw. What happened was, after laying the bridges out, they wanted to find out if they could arrange a path in such a way that all the bridges can only be traversed once, but all the bridges can be traversed. Nobody could answer this question. Then Euler came up with a simple and elegant proof, which was even easily understood by those who were not trained in mathematics. Nevertheless, it is not the proof that made history, but rather the intermediate step that he took to solve the problem. What his layout was, assuming the whole bridge to be collection of nodes and links, what he understood was, for any graph to be for all the edges and nodes to be traversed once and only once, it should follow a feature called if such a feature existed in any graph, then there would only be two nodes, which would be the starting and ending node, and the degree of this node has to be odd, and just all the degrees have to be even. Euler's proof that the Königsberg there, no path crossing all 7 bridges, only one, was based on a simple observation. Nodes with odd number of links must either be the starting or the ending point of the journey. But here there were 4 such bridges. So what the solution he found out was to add few more bridges in such a way that to connect the area C and B, so that there would only be 2 bridges which had odd number of paths to be traversed rather than the 4 bridges which initially had. By this he understood that graphs actually had innate feature in them that define them, and they are not always random in nature. Herodotus was a famous mathematician. He came up with few questions which helped him solve so many proofs and things, whether you created math or it existed. The answer he came up to this thing was, truth already existed even if you don't want to find it. Such things are what Euler studied in the innate features of graphs. Did God enjoy playing dice? By this question, they were able to find out one thing, that whether everything in nature was random, or did everything in nature place itself in such a way that they had already pre-existing innate features. The third link. The world is smaller than you think. It comes to a small concept called 6 degrees of separation. Famous author back then in Hungary, Frigyes Karanathi, wrote a book, This Is How You Write. This 25-year-old virtually unknown poet and writer invented what he called the literary caricature, a volume of collection of short poems and stories that appeared to be by somebody from a big literature world. It was such a hit that there was nobody in Hungary back then who did not read his work. In one such stories, he mentions a concept called 6 degrees of separation. By chance, he was not a great mathematician, but yet he came up with a small concept where through at most 5 acquaintances, one he knew personally could be linked to another chosen person. After almost 3 decades later, in 1967, Stanley Milgram, a Harvard professor who turned this concept into a much celebrated groundbreaking study on interconnectivity. Milgram's goal was to find distance between any 2 people in US. Back then, Harvard and MIT were places to study such network sciences very deeply. He conducted this huge study where he proved empirically how everybody in this world could be connected with just 6 acquaintances in between them. Later, few more scientists taken together how a milligram 6 degrees of separation understood more of connectivity through studying the web back then. If you after studying the web, they came up with another concept called web's 19 degrees that suggests that behind the short observed distances there is something more fundamental, that is to spread and to touch as much things possible. So in web, every web page, every one randomly choose any two web pages and you can connect these both web pages with just 19 links in between them at max. 19 degrees may appear to be drastically far from 6 degrees, but this is not the case. What is important is that in huge networks with 100 millions or billions of nodes collapsing, they display separate, far shorter number of nodes they have. The web with the close to billion nodes has 19 degrees of separation. The internet, a network of like hundreds of thousands of routers, have a separation of 10. So while studying these graphs individually, they came up to such conclusions. Next, a famous a scientist called Mark Granovetter submitted his first ever publication while he was still a graduate in Harvard. He had very high hopes for his manuscript and he was even in the right place, MIT and Harvard, to study network sciences back then. Many of the new ideas proved to have fallen to fertile ground in his thesis. Then he studied a small concept. He understood it while observing around that when one of his friend wanted to find a job, he had two ways to go about it. Go ask people, his close friends, or just go ask people who he just met, some random acquaintances, like somebody who he met at a friend's Thanksgiving or their birthday, or some random person he met while he was watching a movie, or whether he should go ask somebody who is closer to him. Now, many people might actually think that asking someone closer to us might get us better results, but the thing is, while asking somebody in our close-knit community, we probably would know who they would be asking. So while whatever information we want, like a job, a recommendation, any information, it is lost inside the community. While he goes outside the community and asks one of his colleague or not so closely knit acquaintance, probably his message would end up traveling more deeper into the network. Probably him getting a job would become much easier. By this, he learnt the concept of how weak the strength and weak ties, how important the weak social ties in our lives are. He mailed it to the American Sociology Review in August 1969. He received word that two anonymous referees had rejected the paper. They said that this manuscript should not be published for an endless series of reasons that immediately comes to their mind, it seems. That time he was discouraged and he did not touch the paper until the next 3 years. Again in 1972, he submitted somewhat a shortened version of the same manuscript to the journal called the American Journal of Sociology. This time he had a better luck. His paper was published, and after the first submission, it's known as the strength of weak ties. It's recognized in one of the most influential sociology papers ever written, and it's one of the most cited as well. In this, he proposed something that sounds very non-believable at first. When it comes to finding a job, getting news, or launching a restaurant, or spreading any latest fad, our social ties are more important than our long-cherished strong friendships. As he put it, the structure of social networks around an ordinary person, what he calls as an ego, like an ego network, is rather generic. I quote, "Ego will have collection of close friends, most of whom are in touch with one another, a densely knit clump of social structure. Moreover, ego will have a collection of acquaintances, few of which know each other. Each of these acquaintances, however, is likely to have the same close friends in its own right, and therefore to be enmeshed in a closely knit clump of social structure, but one from different ego." So what he specifically states there is the information gets stuck in this closely knit structure. Rather, when we try to push the information outside this closely knit structure, the chances of it spreading is more. Fifth link. Now, Malcolm Gladwell, a staff writer of New York Magazine, describes in his recent book, The Tipping Point, a simple test to measure how social you are. He gives out like 248 surnames compiled from the Manhattan's phone book, and he asks you to point or note down any person with multiple counts are allowed. Like if you know any 3 people with the name Jones or one name on the list, you get 3 points. Like that, he started to run a list by the City College of Manhattan, and most of the people he took for the study were recent immigrants in their early 20s. What he recorded an average score of 21. In other words, he knew 21 people, 21 people with the same surname as somebody on the list. A random group of mostly white, highly educated academic people scored around 39, almost double that of college students. This was hardly surprising, but what caught his attention was the range in which college class scored ranged from 2 to 95. In the random sample, score was like 9 and the high score was around 118. Even for a highly homogeneous group of similar age, education, income, the range was enormous. Lowest score was 16 while the highest was 108. Later he ended up doing the same test of understanding how many people knew the same people of a same surname. He tested up for around 400 people altogether, finding few high scores in every social group he looked at. So at the end he came up to a conclusion. I quote again, sprinkled among every walk of life are few handful of people with truly extraordinary knack of making friends and acquaintances. They are connectors. By this time, the world believed all network structures were random in nature. First Erodo's Rennie, then Strogaard's model, all these came. But this man proved that in any networks there are people who are connectors. They connect clusters, or they are connected to large number of people. But when you see both the graphs proposed till then, they are random in nature and no concept of connectors are there. You cannot tell any particular node is a connector. Later, one day while watching Kevin Bacon's movie The Air Up There, 3 students, Craig Fass, Brian Turtle, Mike Ginelli, students from Albert College of Reading in Pennsylvania, had a revelation. It suddenly occurred to them that Bacon had played so many movies in Hollywood that in January 1994 they mailed a letter to Jon Stewart's show. That time it was a big show, where how the guy described it was, there were 3 men on a mission. Our mission was to prove to Jon Stewart's audience, the world, that Bacon is God. Much to their surprise, they got their 15 minutes of fame. They were invited to appear on Stewart's show with Kevin Bacon himself and charmed the audience with the ability to connect Bacon to any actor whose name was thrown at them with 2-3 people. That time they proved the concept that he was the center of Hollywood and any actor they can take can be connected to Bacon at max of 3 steps. Tom Cruise had Bacon number 1, Mike Myers had 2, like very big famous. Even Charlie Chaplin had a path to Bacon. But afterwards, once the Kevin Bacon was the center of universe thing died away, Glenn Wasson and Brett Tigan of the University of Virginia immediately realized that determining distance between any 2 actors was actually a viable computer science project. What they did, they had they had access to the database of all actors and movies ever released. They created a database that is IMDb right now, imdb.com. But what they understood from this was Kevin Bacon was not actually the center of Hollywood. Once they actually created the whole database and everything was connected, They understood that he was not actually the center of the universe. They were actually calculating average paths, where even there were other actors whose average was much smaller, and smaller than Kevin Bacon's. And even though Kevin Bacon was a prominent Hollywood actor, he had played over 46 movies and has linked to close to 1,800 actors, his separation from everybody else in the Bollywood, like the average distance was 2.78. While there were other actors like Rod Stinger, whose average was 2.53, he stands first, and Donald Pleasence 2.54, and many other actors who were lesser. And once this average distance list was placed out, Kevin Bacon was actually 876th spot, close to the end, but nowhere near the center of Hollywood. Till then people always believed that networks were actually random structures. But a random universe does not support the concept of connectors. Sixth link, the 8x20 rule. Vilfredo Pareto, he was an influential Italian economist. While giving talk in his early 90s in an economics conference in Geneva, was repeatedly and noisily interrupted by his powerful colleague Gustavo von Schmoller. Von Schmoller was whom from his throne at University of Berlin ruled the German academic world. Apparently kept shouting in a patronizing tone, but where are these laws in economics? Despite his aristocratic upbringing, Pareto had little respect for appearance, reportedly having written a monumental work known as Trattato di Sociologia Generale. While owning a single pair of suit and a shoe, he came and he told to von Schmoller on the street, "Please sir, can you tell me where I can find a restaurant where you eat for nothing?" The man replied, "My dear man, there are no such restaurants, but there is a place around the corner where you can have a good meal for very, very cheaply. So, there are laws in economics," he told. But what did Pareto mean by this? Deeply influenced by mathematical beauty of Newtonian physics, he devoted his rest of the life for studying this, and he came up with the concept of 80x20 rule. It's basically 80x20 rule describes the same phenomena. It's like you in a day, whatever 80% of the time you spent on trivial tasks, just give out 20% of the results. But the 20% of the time you spent on few vital tasks ends up giving 80% of results. He studied this in many major things. Like even in Italy back then, 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the rich, while the rest 20% was owned by the 80% of the poor and middle class. If you are not a physicist or a mathematician, you would never actually have heard of these power laws. Mathematically, this concept was proved by using power laws. Pareto developed a principle by observing all that 20% of pea pods in his garden contained 80% of the peas. So he told that nature very generally followed this rule. Later they started to study how actually random networks are and how networks are in real life, and they named this observed networks as scale-free networks. When they plotted the power law distribution for these nodes, they observed bell curve in random networks, and they observed decreasing curve in scale-free networks. That in scale-free networks, there was a part of it, part of group that concentrated high. The seventh link. Rich get richer. There is one thing about the web that like everybody agrees on. It is growing. Like every day new documents are added by individuals, their latest hobbies, interests, or corporations trying to spread their products online, services. Government is also increasingly getting reliant on web professors in college publishing their lecture notes. While this rate of explosion will likely taper as the majority of information is connected by humanity lands online, so far we have not observed it slowing down anywhere. With over a billion documents that are available today online, it's pretty hard to believe that once upon a time all this evolved from just a single node. Despite there's lot of dimensions and there's lot of complexity in this growth, it's still growing incrementally, node by node, and this expansion is in contrast to the assumption of network models that so far were described in the book, Erudos, Rennie and Watt-Strogatz. Assuming that, what's observed is that there's a constant growth over time. After putting the pieces of the puzzle together, they found out the real world networks after doing a lot of studies, after how IMDb, understanding the actors network from IMDb and understanding some tiny real world networks. They understood that they follow two laws, growth and preferential attachment. Every network actually starts from a small nucleus and expands with addition of new nodes. Then these new nodes, when deciding where to link, prefer nodes that have more links. To answer this, in 1990, Science paper produced a network model that incorporates both the laws. First was they gave an algorithm with two straightforward rules, growth. Growth, this tells that in a given period of time we add new node to a network. This step underscores the fact that networks are assembled actually at one place. Then was preferential attachment. We assume that each new node connects to an existing node with two links. Probability that it will choose a given node with more number of links is more. So probably when I add a node to a network, it will go and attach itself to a node of higher degree rather than lower ones. Now, while following these both rules, the graph that comes at the end is actually a scale-free network. Now this scale-free network has the concept of connectors and hubs, which were initially observed in real world. The purpose of the scale-free model is actually very modest, to demonstrate the two laws that could solve the puzzle of hubs and power laws. Hubs and power laws were the two things that was observed in all the networks and all the connections in the world. Power law gave legitimacy to hubs, and hubs was first found out through experiments and observations in the real world. And with this power law, it even gave a mathematical backup for the concepts to advance further. But scale-free models gave rise to a new question. One in particular was, how do latecomers make it in the world in which only rich get richer? So if any new people come to this rich world, how do they become rich? Or will the poor always stay poor? Will they never will they never be part of the bigger picture? Then, now, the author Barabási met Larry Page, as you know, Google CEO. He was a Stanford dropout in March 2000. That time few people had heard of his search engine. It was just a 2-year-old startup back then. They were actually working in some workshop of internet archives in San Francisco, where Larry Page gave a small talk about his search engine and dropped a box of t-shirts in middle of the group in the room, telling a line in Google signature line, "I am feeling lucky." After getting home, the author Barabási even tried it on and logged on to Google, and in no time it became addictive. It was no surprise to me that Yahoo wanted to be a part of it. So now what happened? Google was launched only in 1997, and it was actually latecomer to the web. Back then, popular search engines were like Atlas Vista and Inktomi. They were actually dominating the market long before Google came, and it was so there were actually these big nodes, and Google was the latecomer. But right now, Inktomi is nowhere in the picture. Right now, Google is the most right. We've never any student or any person in this generation most probably don't even know what Inktomi is. But back then, all big companies, Yahoo, American Online, Microsoft, all these high-profile companies did not have search engines of their own, but they were backed up by a single search engine known as Inktomi. Inktomi it didn't choose to create its own personal portal, so it never got any recognition. But suddenly, in June 2000, press noticed that Yahoo's company stock suddenly dropped by 2.8 billion overnight. And the reason was Yahoo had fired Inktomi as its search engine and replaced it with a 2-year-old startup called Google. The reason why Google intrigued the author as well as companies like Yahoo was because it violated the basic prediction of scale-free model, that the first move had an advantage. The first mover actually had the advantage. Scale-free model was like the most connected nodes that appear first. It followed the basic concept. Plus it needed to have they needed to have the longest time to connect links and develop them into hubs. Even though Google was a latecomer, it became the biggest and the most popular. Same thing had with companies like Palm and de Havilland. What happened? Palm was the first thing to come up with tab-like gadgets, but it was not. Even though Apple came later, Apple was more. People were more into it, into buying it because it was more user friendly and all. De Havilland was one of the first companies to manufacture aircraft, but the problem was almost all the flights in mid-air started to crash. Then Boeing came up with a proper solution to it. So right now Palm and de Havilland are nowhere to be found. We can understand a concept called beauty over age, which these days is mathematically represented with a notation called beta. Some people have like a knack for turning random encounters into like a lasting social link. Like some web pages turn normal surfers into addicts in these web pages. So now the issue we saw on the last link when scale-free networks developed was what happens when these late coming nodes, will they always stay poor? But no, for any node to survive, there are two more features, that is fit get rich and winner takes it all. We saw this both happening in Google. We can also observe it in one more success story of Microsoft. Initially, when Paul Allen and Bill Gates came together, they came up with the Microsoft desktop feature. The first time it actually looked like a ripoff of Apple's iOS, but the thing was, it was user friendly. While Apple restricted its software just to limited hardware, Microsoft was compatible with almost all the hardware present, so it was more user friendly. But back then, Bill Gates and Microsoft was known not much for its OS, but it was known to it started to charge on its software. Back then, hackers believed it is not moral to charge on software, but they started to sell the software, even though it was easily copyable. The ninth link, Achilles heel. Now, we saw about connectivity, we saw about features like weak ties, we saw how everything is densely connected or connected to something that is densely connected. Now, definitely there is some vulnerability to this interconnectivity that was observed in power cuts in US. Back then, electricity crisis in California around 2001, it grew so much. yeah, the power grids and all was very very highly connected, that when one place lost its connection, everything started to break down. But in one such case, what happened was, there was a separate island which was very sparsely connected to the rest of the network. So when the breakdown occurred in one place, this one island region was did not lose its power because of its sparse connectivity to the original. Like most systems in real world display like high degree. So when displaying this high degree of tolerance against failures also, they share a common feature, that their functionality is guaranteed by highly interconnected complex network. Its robustness is like hidden in intricate regularity and metabolic networks. And such universal choice of network architecture is perhaps more than just mere coincidence. In the fall of 1999 of Defense Advanced Research Project Agency DARPA circulated like a call for proposals of studying such failing networks. 10th link, that is viruses and fads. Now we understood how real world networks are and how they follow power law, preferential attachment. Now what they did, causing viruses and fads. Now if you see this official Florida presidential ballot, back then when Bush was standing up for presidency, there was so much confusion going on that people didn't know who they were voting for. There was so much confusion in Republicans, that they didn't know who to vote, while only member of Bush's party, from Bush's party, Bush was the only one standing, but from the opposition team, there were so many people that people were confused to vote. So when the person who made this picture posted it online, Mike Collins, it became an instant hit throughout the state, while everybody started to pass this piece of paper and laugh at its irony. Similarly, back then there was this virus. It was launched in Philippines, known as the love bug. It is one of the most damaging computer virus released till date. Every computer literate in the corner of even right now there are some computers which are affected by this virus and they don't even know that they are affected by this virus. How this happened was, you will receive a message that tells I love you, so it's like a crush sending you a message, and immediately you are intrigued and you open it. But the moment you open this message, you are opening your system, you are making your system vulnerable for the attack. Eleventh link, the awakening of internet. A famous computer scientist, Paul Barron, was working in the University of Pennsylvania. He came up with this concept of how network is actually connected. It's not completely centralized, at the same time it's not distributed, but it's somewhere decentralized in nature. When he first showed his work, he was rejected. Later he even saw vulnerability. So he saw, when he took his job in RAND memorandums, he saw these vulnerabilities, that how taking out one important node in this centralized thing could damage the whole thing. So he came up with the better structure in which just destroying one node would not destroy everything. So he came up with the concept of switch in digital systems, but back then it was a bit hard for AT&T had monopoly in communication systems, and when he took his concept to AT&T, Jack Osterman, part of AT&T, squashed his vision and declared that, as I quote, "First, it can't possibly work, and if it did, damned if we are going to allow this creation of a competition to ourselves." Brand's idea, defeated at every step by industry and also military, was discovered only a few years later by ARPA, Advanced Research Project Agency. They were not aware of his results, but they constructed the same vision independently. By then, however, internet was already on the course of development, and his structure of decentralized network was what based internet. But after a lot of development, internet did move away from the type of structure he predicted, but it was very closely what he had specifically mentioned at the beginning, and his results were resembling it. The 12th link, fragmented web. Back then, before 2000 started, science fiction writers and visionaries, they came up with a lot of robots like C3PO from C3PO or R2D2, and later people all predicted maybe by the early 2000s we could have such robots who would be taking care of our work. But now we actually don't have such robots in physical terms taking care of our work. But yes, they do exist. They do exist as tiny software programs in our systems that do our day-to-day work. It became very clear, mapping the whole web was a bit too much for our little engines, but by sneaking around or stalling it, we can actually carry home like 3 lakh web pages to discover their scale-free network. All this was done by this tiny robots. Later, once they started to study this scale-free networks, they even came up with a basic structure, how there is a central core, how there are tubes in directed networks, because in real world there is restriction in traversal and all. How there are tendrils or islands or incontinent, outcontinent. They started to name different sections of the network. The 13th link, map of life. In February 1987, a journal, famous journal Nature, reported a landmark discovery, a gene for maniac depression. Now recently people call it bipolar disorder. Maniac depression, back then what it was called, affects 1 to 5% of adults in USA. As many as 25 to 50% of people who actually attempted suicide at least once, because the risk of developing this maniac depression is 5 to 10 times higher if the first degree relatives have this disease. So this maniac depression was actually a genetic disorder. Soon as the methods for linking illness and the specific gene emerged, in authors in 1987 Nature paper, they started to locate this gene in chromosome level 11 while studying a large Amish family in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Yet 2 years later, the research group recanted the results. They took them back. The blunder did not discourage other gene hunters who were studying this gene, but rather it gave them extra motivation to actually find the gene that was causing this maniac depression. In 1996, almost like a decade later of the initial published study, 3 independent research groups reported the links of genes in other chromosomes. Another Amish study implicated the chromosome 6, 13, 15. After studying this in a isolated population, they started to see links in these chromosomes, and wherever such similar pattern was found, they actually started to get better results. Then in June 26, 2000, President Bill Clinton released the statement telling, "Today we are learning the language in which God created life." So they were announcing a study in which decoding of 3 billion chemical letters of human genome. It was like handing a book of life in which human was actually created. You will see a text of about 3 billion letters filling 10,000 copies of New York Times Sunday edition, each looking like it's like a big line made up of T, C, A, G, these characters in different patterns. These were actually abbreviations of molecules making up our DNA. Decoding our human genome offered us inventory to cell paths. It's like studying analogies of different structures. So they came up with, they ended up decoding all the 3 billion letters of helical DNA, and they mapped them, in which they were studying how which similar patterns repeating in people were causing disease and all. Next, the 14th link, network economy. 10 years ago, a very largely unknown internet startup, desperately short of cash, then the manager of Time Warner, a member of startup's directorial board, saw these problems as an opportunity for entertainment giant that he worked for. So therefore he suggested Time Warner senior executive that they bail out the startup for a mere 5 million. The media conglomerate could have owned 11% of the company. This would be petty cash for Time Warner that would have offered access to internet at the time. So what he did, he certainly took a terrible stock picker. 10 years later, that 5 million investment would have been worth 15 billion. The purchase would have altered history too. A decade later, Steve Case, the CEO of American Online, the once unknown internet startup, and Jerry Levine, the chairman of Time Warner, announced the merger of these two companies at Manhattan Press. Few years earlier, Time Warner could have easily digested the internet startup in 2000. However, it was American Online, a company that few had heard a decade earlier, that swallowed the media giant Time Warner, that initially was its parent company. Time Warner had content, but AOL had the means of delivering it to the customer. So before the collapse of Nasdaq bubble in spring 2000, Jerry Levin was under pressure to go .com to regain Wall Street's attention. Steve Case, AOL, needed access to Time Warner's cable to get into your living room. Despite very different cultures of these two companies, business analysts were eager to convince us that it was a match made in heaven. Same analyst has told us that in 1998, Dalman-Ben's takeover of Crystal was sound step for both companies. So was the fusion of oil industry titan Exxon and Mobil in 1998, 4 months after a major acquisition, better than British Petroleum. So such acquisitions and major takeovers started to result in another organizational structure. You can see how CEO, COD, CFO, all these are like forming of tree-like structures of management lines. How in a network, a node of a very small degree can over time grow up to become net of a higher degree and take place of its parent node. Similarly, we can see what happened with Hotmail. Back then when Hotmail's Sabir Bhatt, he didn't know how to sell a company, but being born and raised in India, he only knew how to buy onions. So he knew how to negotiate. He picked up his partner Jack Smith on July 4th, 1996 and launched a service offering nothing but emails, like free to anybody in the world. They named it Hotmail. They followed the same concept of love bug, like once a message is sent, there will be a link attached to it telling create free Hotmail email ID, and that's how he spread. Right now almost quarter of the world and mostly India and all these countries have the highest Hotmail users. Back then Microsoft's 26 buildings set up in Redmond, they invited him there in Washington and he was shaking hands with Bill Gates, and Bill Gates offered to buy Hotmail for 160 million. Then Sabir Bhatia told, I'll get back to you, and he walked away. Later Microsoft eventually paid 400 million for this company, and right now its net worth is 6 billion. What was like its reason for its phenomenal success? They did a study and they understood how it made people sign up to it. The last link, a web without a spider. Now what actually happens in this is, in real world, if you can see this picture, there are two people, one Osama bin Laden, the head of Al-Qaeda, and the second is Pablo Escobar. He is a legendary smuggler, and you won't have this Netflix cine drama after him, Narcos, really good. how he was famous for the start of Colombian drug cartel. Now these both people, they're the initial nodes in a network that is formed in their immediate future, a huge network. Right now also people are not able to erase. How Osama bin Laden started Al-Qaeda, and even after his death, even though he was the central person who created, who grew the network, even after he is dead, they are not able to erase the network he has created. How Pablo Escobar introduced cocaine into cocaine selling and cocaine business in America. He's still, even though he has been killed later, still the network he has created is not being able to be cleared. So it's like a spider of a web. Once the spider creates its web, even though the spider disappears, it's really hard to remove the web.